Hey folks, so we had a huge result today in MVL, taking down the clear leader Jan Nepomniachtchi in the round 7 of the 2020 FIDE Candidates. It was a pretty sharp game. Nepo went for the French again, but I feel like he just didn't really get a very comfortable position, not really in his style, and I think MVL just played like a really fantastic game, one of the best of the tournament in my opinion. The other 3 games finished in a draw. No one really had any huge advantage that they threw away. It was all pretty small and manageable. Fabi was a little bit worse in the end game against Wang Hao. Giri and Grischuk drew relatively comfortably. And Dingleren actually ran into a little bit of trouble against Lengsenko, but was ultimately able to manage things. So this is now the halfway point of the tournament. Now the players are going to repeat the pairings from the first 7 rounds, but with reverse colors. Tomorrow we're going to see a big game in Caruana White against MVL. Kind of a must-win game for Fabi if he really wants to be a contender towards the end of the tournament. But right now MVL is looking great. He hasn't lost any games yet. Nepo has been doing brilliantly, but now that he's lost a game, of course, one has to wonder whether he is going to be able to just forget about it and just return to the form from the first 6 rounds of the tournament, or if he's going to kind of pull a typical Nepo and kind of collapse and start losing game after game, as we saw him do a couple of times, notably in the Grand Chess Tour last year in Zagreb. He had this brilliant start and then he just completely collapsed towards the end. So we'll see mentally if he's able to really keep up. So going into our main game of the day, MVL versus Nepo. Once again, Jan chooses the winner word here with bishop b4. He busted this out against Alexyenko earlier in the tournament, and it seems like it wasn't just a one-game surprise, but actually something that he prepared to play multiple times in this tournament. But this is, quite dangerous to do against a guy like MVL, who is not only well prepared, but is also just a very strong attacker. Here MVL deviates from that previous game against Alexyenko with the move h5 here, just running this pawn up the board. Black plays h6, white goes rook to b1. Not the most common move in the position, but quite a logical one just to put this rook on b1 early on. Black played b6, queen to g4, and here Nepo decides to play rook to g8. Now this is actually surprisingly playable for black. A lot of games have also continued with king f8 in this position. I mean, it looks very strange at first, but black's big idea here is that the center is closed. The long-term structure is kind of nice for black, with white always having these weak doubled c-pawns and a-pawn to worry about. And if black gets into a situation where he can trade the light-squared bishops under good terms, then he's going to have a lot of long-term chances in the future if white is not able to generate this attack. But I really like how MVL plays this one. He goes bishop b5 check, black goes king to f8, drops the bishop back to d3, bishop a6, and now it takes on c5. Really interesting decision. He's essentially opening up the queen side here, and strategically this makes a lot of sense because black's king on f8 is safe on the king side, but it's not going to be safe if the queen side opens up. So here black decided to take on d3. Could have also just recaptured with bc here. Not sure if this was still within MVL's preparation or not. I'm guessing he would continue with something like knight f3. Then the position after c4, bishop e2, knight c6, definitely feels very unclear to me. I mean, black has a lot of good squares in the position, but white is certainly in charge of the dark squares and is going to be looking for ideas like a4, putting the bishop on a3, or putting the bishop on e3, and ultimately just like a very double-edged position. Instead, Nepo trades here, c takes d3, goes knight d7, kind of offering a pawn, but white cannot really take this one. c3 pawn will be hanging, and then black will just have a ton of compensation, a ton of counterplay on the queen side. Instead, MVL goes d4, b takes c5, and now a very strong move, queen to d1. I mean, it looks totally bizarre. He's like undeveloping the only piece he had out in the game. But he realizes that the queen on g4 is not really doing much. It's going to be much stronger on a4. And also, once he develops his knight to f3, which is where it wants to go, then his queen on g4 is basically going to be stranded. So this is kind of his last chance to get his queen into a good position. Black played queen a5, bishop d2. Now the engine suggests that black should have just grabbed this pawn and tried to live to tell the tale. Knight e2, queen a6, castles. I think white has huge compensation here because black's problem is that the rook on g8, king on f8 really need to switch places in this position. And if black isn't able to castle by hand, then as solid as the structure is, it's not going to compensate for the fact that the rook is out of the game. So instead, Nepo goes rook to b8, knight e2, and then c4. Now this move was criticized by MVL after the game, saying that this was kind of the wrong plan for black in this position, but I actually think the situation was already quite difficult. The alternative that MVL suggested, king e8, castles in king d8, trying to get the rook in with king c7, concretely this one just ends up bad. White can trade rooks and play c4, and everything opens up, and black's king is just not going to get safe in time. Especially this bishop, once it gets into the game, is going to be really strong. I think the engine was suggesting rook b1 here, and then queen to a6, trying to hold white away from castling for the moment. White can play something like a4. It's still kind of a tough situation, maybe better than what happened in the game, but black is clearly worse in my opinion. The game continued c4, castles, rook b6, queen c2, really simple and strong. White's idea is to just bring the rook into b4, bring the second rook to b1, and just play on the queen side with an extra rook. Even though this bishop on d2 is technically bad, eventually you might be able to get into the game, often via the c1 and a3 squares. Here rook h8 was played. I guess he didn't want to allow the queen into h7, which could be very annoying. a4, king to e8, rook b4, knight c6, and now a really nice idea to play f4. Perhaps Nepo was getting some deja vu here from his game against Alexenko, who also sacrificed and exchanged on the b4 square. Although this is not a real sacrifice, if black takes on b4, c takes b4, queen a6, b5, queen b7, f5. I mean, white is down material, but his position is just absolutely crushing, and the knight is coming to f4. Black, of course, cannot castle here, as he's already moved both his king and his rook, and black's position is just going to collapse very quickly. Rook on b6, queen on b7, all of black's pieces are basically bad. So instead, Nepo goes back, knight to e7, but now white starts fighting for the queen side. Black goes f5 here. Now, I think he would be really happy if white took this one en passant, because at least he can take with his knight and finally get some squares for his pieces. But of course, MVL just leaves the pawn on f5, plays rook b5. Bishop c1 starts putting all of his pieces on the best squares. Rook b8 takes the knight on e7 in order to facilitate his next idea, which is to break through with g4. And this is why he wasn't really worried about allowing black this f5 pawn, because he always has this g4 break in mind. If black takes on g4 here, then as an example, white can first trade rooks. Rook takes b6, go rook f1 here, followed by f5. The king side is going to open up, the knight is going to come to g3, and the black's pieces are just terribly misplaced here. The queen is also itching to go to g6 as well. Instead, black took on b5, took on b5 again, white takes on f5, rook takes b1, queen takes b1, e takes f5, and knight g3. This is kind of white's point from afar, where black just doesn't have a great way to defend the f5 pawn. If g6, white can either take this one or even play a move like king to f2, threatening to first take, queen takes g6, and then take this pawn on f5. So black's position would ultimately just be collapsing here. Queen b6 was played. White takes on f5 with check, king f8, and now queen a1, keeping the queens on the board, which I think is very smart. Rather than going for the endgame, white keeps a lot of attacking chances alive with queen to a3 here. Queen e6 was played, knight g3, queen g4, king g2. He's not worried about the f4 pawn as he's taking on a7, and white's queen and knight are again just outperforming their counterparts. The game ended pretty quickly after king d8, queen d6. Now white is threatening to take the d pawn as well as pushing e6 if black's queen doesn't stay on f4. Black tried g5, h6, g6, h5, g7, and that was that. So a really high quality game by MVL. I think similar to his win against Ding Liren, just very clean, not allowing his opponent counterplay, just outplaying them from start to finish, and just winning two very, very nice games. So right now, MVL must be feeling pretty good. I mean, he's in good form. He's one of the only players that hasn't lost a game yet, and clearly he's on a roll. He just defeated the tournament leader in what was clearly just a very important game for him. Moving on to the game between Fabi and Wang Hao. Here Wang Hao plays the Petrov defense, which of course was Fabiano's specialty over the last couple of years, and the opening he relied on heavily in his World Championship match against Magnus. But of course, this is also a Chinese specialty. A lot of Chinese players play the Petrov defense, and this is not the first time Wang Hao has used this opening either. Now, interestingly enough, Caruana uses a line that Magnus played against him. Here with white, he goes bishop d3, c5, rook e1, and the two players actually follow one of the World Championship games up until the 14th move here. White plays c4, black goes for this endgame, and here instead of taking with the bishop on d2 like Magnus did, Fabi decides to take with the knight. His position was okay. I don't think his advantage was that great. Somewhere he ends up just kind of giving up the initiative for black. He starts pushing g4, g5, and heading to the critical moment here. Turn knight e4, f5, takes. This was the moment that Jesse chose for his move of the day series, where Fabi played bishop g5, but the move knight g5 was probably going to give better chances for him. To catch a full breakdown of this game and this endgame that the two players played out, definitely make sure to catch Jesse's move of the day video is really instructive. After bishop g5, king f7, knight g3, it looks like white is definitely creating some play here with knight to f5, but black is basically just in time with c4 and b5. Kind of counterintuitive to put the pawns on the light squares, but at the same time, black is able to shut down white's light squared bishop and now stands slightly better. Wang Hao definitely tried to play on for a bit, but eventually the game was agreed drawn. Moving on to the game between Anish Giri and Alexander Grischuk. These two had a game in the English opening, and a pretty tricky line where black takes on d5 with the queen here, and really has to hold on to this pawn on e4 in the center, which he can do with accurate play, but definitely a very double-edged position. So the novelty in this game comes on move 10 after bishop e7. Grischuk previously had a game against Tomaszewski that went d3, e takes d3, queen takes d3, and here after knight c5, queen d4, takes, white was actually slightly better in this endgame. These 4 pawns on the king side often can become very dangerous if white is able to push e4, f4, e5, and so on. But I'm sure Grischuk had some kind of improvement planned here, maybe the move castles as the engine suggests. But in any case, Giri doesn't wait to find out, instead comes up with his own improvement with knight to e3. Then after a bit of a think, Grischuk plays the most thematic move out there nowadays, h5. I mean, we've seen this move in almost every game where there's a fianchetto on the board. And here it's also quite logical. Black has good control over the center, decent development. Even the bishop on c8, we can say, is certainly participating in the game, and again just wants to play h4 and either get some play on the king side by taking and opening the h-file, or by pushing h3 and kind of shutting in white's bishop and creating some long-term problems for white's king. I think this was still well within Giri's prep. He plays d4 here, e takes d3, e takes d3, queen d4. In the post-game interview, he mentioned that somewhere around here, he couldn't really remember what his preparation was, but black's position is solid. I have a feeling it might have been this move knight to e2, followed by h3, just kicking back the queen and trying to play for a little bit of an initiative in the middle game. Overall, black's position is solid. In the game, Giri ends up choosing bishop f4, allowing black to trade queens and go for this endgame, where I think despite white's activity, black is doing quite okay here, as he is playing against this isolated queen pawn, and now that the queens have been exchanged, white definitely has to be careful not to let this pawn turn into a long-term weakness. So the game actually pretty quickly peters out into a drawn position. Here Giri decides to just push forward with d5, which ends up exchanging a lot of pieces. He had other ways to maybe keep a little bit more play on the board, for instance with a move like bishop to e5, but black's position is just very, very solid here. The bishop on g2 is surely just kind of stuck against hammering against this pawn chain. So we saw d5, takes, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now rook takes d5. Not really a trick. If black goes c takes d5, bishop h3 check, black will have to give the exchange back, and white is definitely not worse here, maybe just slightly better. Instead, Grischuk decides to take with the rook, bishop takes d5, c takes d5. white is down a pawn momentarily, but he gets rook c1 check, king d7, and rook c7, and he's able to get the b pawn back. However, after rook c8, I think if anyone is slightly better here, it's probably black, although both of the players seem to think that there was nothing more than a draw here for either side. And the game really did not last much longer. After king g2, black decided, despite having a slightly better passed pawn and more active king, Grischuk decides to just pitch the pawn and liquidate into a completely drawn rook endgame. Although I would tell you guys, if you have this kind of position where you're slightly better, your opponent is not going to be as skilled a defender as someone like Anish Giri or any one of the other elite guys. I would definitely recommend playing these types of positions out, trying to keep your pawn on the board and keeping your activity, and maybe just trying to pose a few problems for the opponent before acquiescing to the draw. And finally, we have the game between Ding Liren and Kirill Aleksenko. Of course, Ding is probably still reeling from his third loss in the tournament, which happened yesterday, or in the previous round. In this game, the players end up playing a Catalan after black transposes back with this move d5. And a very solid line, these lines with bishop b4 check followed by bishop to e7, they have a very solid reputation, as white's bishop on d2 is not able to get to b2 where it's typically considered to be well placed. So Ding chooses a pretty standard setup here with bishop f4, rook d1, knight bd2. And I would say the position was very balanced. Here black offers a repetition. Of course, Ding doesn't take it. Despite him having a bad tournament, he's still a very ambitious player and wants to play for the win whenever possible. And I think he actually did have a little bit of an advantage here. After a couple of trades, we're left with this middle game where, okay, it does look like white has a slightly better bishop than the bishop on b7, but at the same time, black's position is very solid. So now Kirill goes f6, and white ends up taking on f6 here, knight takes f6, and the structure ends up being pretty much okay for black. Though one interesting opportunity was to play the move queen a4 here, where if black is going to be grabbing this pawn on e5, white will be winning the pawn on a7. And here the key idea is that black does not have this resource with queen c7. This would be good if not for the fact that white can actually just start taking on d5 and using the pin along the c file, and here white is just winning material and winning the game. So black could not really go for this. So after queen a4, I'm not exactly sure what he would have done, because white is also threatening ideas to take on d5 and take on g4. So this was actually kind of white's chance to get a little bit of initiative here and start posing some real problems. Instead, after ef6, knight takes f6, we have bishop h3, black goes rook e8, and now queen a4 is definitely a serious mistake. Ding admitted after the game he missed his opponent's reply to play c5 here, which is a very strong move. Now if white takes on a7, then after queen to c7, white doesn't have an easy way to rescue the queen, and black is starting to play rook a8 here, as well as just pushing d4 and getting this huge counterplay along the diagonal. So already white is in danger of being seriously worse in this position. So Ding did not take the pawn on a7, starts playing for complications, chooses the move b4, and although black was definitely better in this game, he's able to muddy the waters enough that black's route to a clear advantage was definitely not that clear. The game knight c3 took place, rook e1, d takes d4. Now black's pawns look very strong, but it's important for white that he has this move a3 to kind of undermine everything. I think this was kind of the last moment where black could have grabbed here. Bishop takes f3, rook e6, and according to the engine, black is slightly better here, but yeah, from a human point of view, these kinds of situations always look extremely risky, as well white now has good piece play, and black is kind of relying on these b and c pawns. But black definitely has to be careful about not just getting mated on the back rank, not blundering both of these pawns away. So I can understand why he didn't want to go for this. Instead, Kirill keeps a little bit more control in the situation with bishop to d5. Then after queen b4, we get a bunch of trades. Rook takes f3, bishop g2, rook to d2, and yeah, as long as white doesn't take on d5 here and give black some very strong connected passed pawns, although even this might be fine. Well, white doesn't need to go for this, and white is just going to be okay here. And pretty soon the game trades down into this 3 versus 3 rook endgame, where black really just doesn't have any realistic chances whatsoever. White blockades the pawn, brings the king in, and pretty soon the players just repeated moves with black not being able to make progress. So not a great game by Ding. He was pretty critical of his own play after the tournament, but he was able to hold it and avoid another disaster. So going into the second half of the tournament, we have a really tight-knit field. I mean, only 2 points separates the first place from the last place. Definitely the biggest surprise is Ding Liren doing quite badly. I think Kirill so far has had a decent showing. Obviously not a lot of people were expecting him to really put up a lot of points, but he's clearly not a bad participant in the tournament, and he has had some chances actually to even pull off some potential upsets, and I'm sure he'll be looking to actually score a win in the second half of the tournament. And as more players are now having to start to take risks, people are going to be playing a lot more aggressively against him and likely giving him opportunities to punish them for their risky play. Clearly the top 3 players here in this list, MVL, Nepo, and Fabi, I would say have the best chances of actually winning this thing. Fabi has the same number of points as Giri, Wang Hao, and Grischuk, but you know, he's been there before. He won the tournament last year. He has that killer spirit. I'm sure his eyes are only set on first place, and well, he has a big game with MVL coming up tomorrow that will certainly draw a lot of attention. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this recap. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll be seeing you in future videos. Take care.